Okay, so I'm going to divide the talk into three major sections. The first one is going to be sort of what is the Anthropocene. The second one is going to be an overview of how educational researchers are using the Anthropocene concept in their work. And then the third part of the talk is going to be how I am thinking with the Anthropocene in my own research and teaching. This is an image taken from an Anthropocene podcast from Stanford University, published on grist.org. And I thought it was very telling, and you'll know more about why it's so telling at the end of this talk. So I'm going to start with the natural sciences because the concept of the Anthropocene sort of originated in the natural sciences. And I thought that it would be helpful to provide a diagram or a chart of the geologic history and geologic timescale, so how geologists make sense of the history of the Earth. So you can see on this diagram that you have here all the way over to the left eons, and then eons are broken into smaller sections of time called eras, which are broken up into smaller sections of time called periods, and then even smaller sections of time called epochs. And we are currently officially in what's called the Holocene epoch, but it is proposed that we have now entered or will be entering what's called the Anthropocene epoch. So citing physical and biological evidence, including significant alterations to biogeochemical cycles and extinction rates, the Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen and biologist Eugene F. Stormer first advanced the term Anthropocene. And this is a quote from one of the papers that they originally wrote. In a flurry of scientific publications since this initial proposal, Crutzen, Steffen, and their colleagues have endeavored to establish an Anthropocene timeline. So let me go to the next slide. Have endeavored to establish an Anthropocene timeline, understand the impacts of humans on Earth's planetary systems up to and during the epoch, promote technologically based solutions for planetary damage, and advocate that the International Union of Geological Sciences Commission on Stratigraphy, it's a lot, officially inaugurate the term. So these are sort of the four main regarding the Anthropocene concept. In 2007, paper Steffen, Crutzen, and McNeil, again natural scientists, argue that we are currently of the Anthropocene. This rate acceleration, which is a time of growth of human population, also atmospheric carbon dioxide, and a pushing against all sorts of planetary boundaries, so limits in terms of the amount of the alterations that we've made to other biogeochemical cycles, including nitrogen and phosphorus. Their hope is that in 2015, which is where we obviously are right now, that we will enter stage 3, which would entail us as humans becoming stewards of the Earth system through what they call mitigation pathways that, quote, take the human pressure off the Earth system by improved technology and management, wise use of Earth's resources, control of human and domestic animal population, and careful use and restoration of the natural environment. This term, while seemingly innocuous scientific concept to scientists, has inspired a fierce debate about what it means to be human as we consider naming a geological epoch after ourselves. So if we go back to, for a second to this slide here, you'll see that none of the other geological epochs, periods, eras, or eons have been named after humans. Okay, so moving forward, so what this essentially did was then spark a flurry of debate and conversation in the environmental humanities and environmental social sciences regarding what it means not only to name an epoch after ourselves, but what it means for human action in the future. On the whole, a lot of the writing in the environmental social sciences and humanities around the Anthropocene is concerned with questions of ontology. For example, how does the Anthropocene ask us to be different kinds of humans than in the past? Or does it only reinscribe problematic modes of being inherited from the Enlightenment, settler colonialism, and the industrial and green revolutions? On the poverty of our nomenclature, environmental sociologists to the Anthropocene, but also means that break course. Anthropocene term epitomizes Anthropocene the complex. Further, she problematizes many of what she calls Anthropocene themes, to embrace of technological solutions and especially human hubris. So Chris did an analysis of a lot of the language that surrounds the Anthropocene, and in that 2013 publication, kind of laid out and deconstructed all of these themes that braid the discourse of the Anthropocene. Jeremy Baskin, while not emphatically focusing on the impacts of the Anthropocene for the more than human world, as Chris, argues that the Anthropocene is not scientific concept, but actually a paradigm or worldview. And he identifies what he calls 4 major moves of the Anthropocene, which mirror in some ways Chris' themes that braid the discourse. These include the normalization of a certain portion of humanity, an elevation of man above nature, an unquestioned embrace of instrumental reason and technology, and a legitimation of non-democratic technophilic approaches to planetary management. Let me switch to the next slide. This takes a lot of coordination between your talk and your slides.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. Viewing the Anthropocene as something related to opportunity, political ecologist Laura Ogden and colleagues view the Anthropocene through a global assemblages approach, arguing that the Anthropocene calls on us to critically examine the articulations between the local and the global as we place humans back in socio-ecological systems. Ogden et al. Call for attention to how grassroots groups define the Anthropocene. And then finally, responding to critiques like Chris and Baskin, environmental philosopher Morton contends that the Anthropocene term, but not necessarily the themes, is not speciesist, racist, in charge, but the most anti-anthropocentric concept, not because it acknowledges our entanglement with living and material in unprecedented ways. So then I thought it would be worth to briefly talk about the Ecomodernist Manifesto, which is a document that was published earlier this year by folks at the Breakthrough Institute in the Silicon Valley of California. It's a document composed by primarily scholars, although there's a few business leaders and folks who work at think tanks. And without going into too much detail here, their focus is on the evolution of a good or even great Anthropocene, and some of you may have seen responses in the popular media to this manifesto. This good or great Anthropocene, in their estimation, will be ushered in through decoupling humans and nature and dramatically intensifying technological innovation and technological production. So things like GMOs, geoengineering, industrialized agriculture, cloning, proposal as Promethean, racist, colonialist, humanist, and speciesist, and it's by promoting an odyssey of Leibniz theodicy. Only in the manifesto, human-directed progress takes the place of God in what Bruno Latour calls a utopian Euchronist vision. Uh-oh. Can you guys?
What's that?
Can you guys hear me? Because you disappeared for a second.
Yeah, we've had a little bit of connection problem with due to bandwidth.
Okay. Okay. So did you all get what I just said about Bruno?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We could try that. Yeah, we might try actually. If you don't mind turning your video off, because I think that will save bandwidth. We might get the audio better.
How do I do that exactly?
Okay, so that's a good question. The little green camera under your name, under participants. If you go to participants, find yourself.
Okay.
And then by yourself, you should see a little green camera. You click on that, it should take it off. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Okay. So some of these critiques were just published in a special section of the journal Environmental Humanities just very recently. Okay. So part two, now I'm going to talk about how the Anthropocene is being used in educational research. So just over 2 years ago, the editors of the Interdisciplinary Social Science journal, Environment, Society, Advances in Research, sent out a call for a special issue of the journal themed on the Anthropocene. And what I have done here is replicated a quote from that CFP. The journal publishes critical reviews, many of which draw on empirical data of some sort. So they said, quote, "Our concern is thus not so much with the Anthropocene as immutable fact, inevitable event, or definitive period of time, significant though these are, but rather for the political, social, and intellectual consequences of this important idea. Thus, we seek to understand the creativity of the Anthropocene as a political, rhetorical, and social category." So as I read this, it really appealed to me as I wondered how environmental ed researchers were grappling, if at all, with the political, social, and intellectual consequences of this concept or idea. So I wrote a proposal to critically review the extant educational research literature while also conducting a critical textual analysis of the framework for K-12 science education in the United States. I chose the framework because it's a brand new document that's set to radically change science education in the United States. And in the United States, unfortunately, at this point, most environmental education is taught as a subset of science in classrooms. So that's really kind of the place to go to look at environmental ed in the U.S. So I was curious to examine how, if at all, Chris themes of the Anthropocene framed the discourse, because the word Anthropocene wasn't used in the document. But when I did cursory reads of it, I felt and I noticed anecdotally before I did my textual analysis that some of those themes seem to be popping up. So I thought this analysis would also be useful given that national frameworks and standards typically legitimate certain forms of knowledge, marginalize others, and serve as a really kind of powerful tool to shape what counts as knowledge at the local level. So before I talk about the critical review and my analysis of the framework, I should say a bit about political ecology. Because it is a political ecological analysis that really guided my analysis of the framework and the rest of the paper that I wrote that was recently published in the journal. Political ecology is an interdisciplinary field with roots in anthropology and geography that considers the production of knowledge about the environment as inherently political. Early political ecology, influenced by cultural ecology, emphasized structure and systems, and was critiqued as functionalist and reductionist. However, as postmodern, post-structuralist, and post-colonial work influenced political ecology, as it has environmental education, the field gradually shifted to a more significant focus on symbols and agency. Armed with what Robin calls eclectic equipment, political ecologists now draw on common property theory, green materialism, peasant studies, feminist development studies, discourse theory, critical environmental history, post-colonial theory, and actor network theory, and other approaches. Reacting to earlier structural writings, political ecologists also began to question some of the fundamental humanist assumptions of the field through conversing with the post-humanities and animal geography. One of the things that most attracts me to political ecology, particularly when thinking about the Anthropocene, is quite related to points raised above in the Ogden et al. Article that I referenced with this idea of global assemblages. Political ecology helps me to think about the complex ways in which the local, regional, national, and global are messily entangled and connected. For me, posthumanist political ecology is not about getting past humans or humanity per se. It's about decentering the rational speaking human of the Enlightenment. It's a place to ask important ontological questions that demand us to rethink what it means to be human. And it demands that we also consider the political context in which human-nature relations occur. So in many ways, feminist posthumanist political ecologies resonate with feminist post-structuralism, which is more commonly invoked in environmental education. But I think feminist posthumanist theories and frameworks resonate more with my work because they emphasize that decentering a prefigured human subject is important for humanity and also for living and non-living entities who not only co-produce knowledge with us, but also have their own lives. Because I do feminist research, but I have yet to consider gender as a primary analytic lens, I have also been asked how my work is feminist. This is not an easy question to answer, but I think posthumanism sometimes goes too far beyond the human for me. When folks work to be anti-anthropocentric and simply reinscribe different kinds of anthropocentrism, or when there is an extreme decentering of the human that seems to want to put inert matter like pencils or laptops on the same sort of ethical plane as living entities, as in some new materialist approaches. So I think that attention to feminist theory, the attention that feminist theory gives to relationality, embodiedness, and emotion, decenters the prefigured human who has, as Helena Pedersen points out, certain cognitive, social, and moral abilities, and recognizes that there are ontological differences among living entities and between living and non-living entities. Serious posthumanists would probably argue that my brand of posthumanism is too anthropocentric, and social feminists would probably argue that my feminism is not focused enough on the lives of women, but I'm okay with these criticisms. Okay, so moving on from that long section. So what I'm going to do here is spend a little bit of time talking about what I found in the educational research literature. I conducted my literature review beginning the fall of 2013 and then continued through the beginning of this year. So there may be some more recent papers that are not included in this literature review, although I have included a few of those here that I found. So I didn't find much. I was surprised that I didn't find more. Many of the papers that I found did not theoretically frame the paper with the Anthropocene concept, but instead sort of mentioned it along the lines of, you know, we're entering a new geological epoch, and so we need to consider such and such questions, but then they didn't really theoretically or analytically engage with the Anthropocene concept in a meaningful way. Actually found that only a small number of educational scholars at this point are critiquing the term. There are more that are critiquing the themes, but there is some literature that's sort of just accepting the term and the themes. There are several exceptions, of course, which I'll discuss. Since my literature review is a critical literature review and this analysis of the literature, I apply a feminist, posthumanist, political ecology lens to point to areas of needed research. So on the slide here, you'll see these kind of three categories. So the first is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary approaches. The second is an emphasis on community and or participatory-based approaches. And then the last is what I call alternative. And I use the word alternative with sort of reservation. These were papers that really didn't fit into any of the other categories, but I thought that they were important to mention because I think that it's this category of papers that's really doing the most interesting things with the Anthropocene concept. Okay, so one of the most prominent arguments under current educational writing about the Anthropocene is the need for interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary approaches in both research and pedagogical practice. Advocates of these approaches argue that the Anthropocene demands new interactions between science and society and an emphasis on interconnectivity of processes. However, this literature doesn't really address fundamentally anthropocentric beliefs about human-nature relations that could impact these practices. And then this literature, which I think is probably the most serious issue currently, is that the literature doesn't address epistemic attentions among the disciplines, which is something that political ecologists write quite a bit about. So that is, if you have an interdisciplinary collaboration, in what ways is the science privileged over the other ways of knowing in those disciplinary collaborations? In what ways does the funding, which is typically obtained because of the scientific component of the project, in what ways does that funding agency then impact what kinds of knowledge you're authorized to produce in these interdisciplinary projects? So that was one area of research would be, you know, fruitful for the future. And then several papers discussed these community and participatory-based approaches, and primarily these were discussed in the context of the natural sciences, though of course scholars outside of the natural sciences also use community and participatory-based methods. So citizen science, for those of you that are not familiar with it, specifically involves community members and data collection processes whereby their findings are shared, often through the internet with working scientists. Community-based participatory research, in contrast, involves university-based scientists and their students working collaboratively with the community, community-driven versus scientist-driven projects. although research in disciplines, I mentioned that already. The basic argument is that we need new ways of doing science in and for the Anthropocene. Old ways of doing science are not working. We need new ones. Each of these approaches, however, refrains from a lot of things that I think are really important. The first one is addressing the political dimensions of teaching and learning about the environment and doing science. How do funding structures play a role in these projects? Who is authorized to produce knowledge? Why? How does this impact the knowledge that is circulating? How at all do these methods challenge the humanist managerial themes of the Anthropocene, or any of the themes of the Anthropocene, for example, the salience of technology in ameliorating environmental crises? These methods include non-humans as co-learners and co-authors, or as objects. So there's a lot of problematic sort of things that are not teased out in this literature that I think are worth exploring, and I'm actually going to come back to at the end of my presentation when I talk about my own work. So then in the alternative approaches, there's a variety of different things going on. The first one is mobilized in post-carbon social theory. And in this body of research, the scholars focus mainly on geography education in the Anthropocene and also English education. So they argue that geography education ought to focus on this concept called mobile lives that allows students to explore the relationship between climate change and wider systems of economic mobility and challenge the apolitical narrative of human progress and development. And this focus on mobile lives, I think, is really sort of important because it's something that we as academics converse about quite a bit. So here I am giving a presentation. I tell everybody at the University of Saskatchewan, but I'm not really at the University of Saskatchewan, which is kind of important to think about in terms of our own sort of carbon footprints as we, as scholars, engage in our own mobile lives. And then post-carbon English taught through the lens of eco-criticism, focusing on cultural responses to mediating environmental crises. So then there's a very small number of scholars, two for the most part. David Greenwood published on the Anthropocene, and then there's also scholars affiliated with the Common World Research Collective. I've talked a little bit about indigenous thought, and they have highlighted how Western education, a humanist endeavor defined by the ontological dialectic of human other, serves to justify mastery over nature and to delegitimize certain indigenous engagements with the cultural landscape. These scholars contend that indigenous epistemologies and ontologies have transformative potential in the Anthropocene. Political ecological thinking is really important here, I think, because it provides tools to examine how attempts to incorporate indigenous modes of thought into educational systems unfold in practice and are impacted by wider Anthropocene themes like a managerial mindset. And it also offers a critical space to think about how community and participatory-based projects with indigenous communities reciprocally impact traditional modes of thought. So how does Western education consume, subsume, co-opt, and challenge indigenous modes of being and thought, and how is this problematic? So I think that there really needs to be a kind of a critical analysis there as well. And then finally, the scholars in the Common World Research Collective have used posthumanist and feminist thought to challenge the anthropocentric paradigms of both the Anthropocene and education. They focus on embodied encounters between preschool-aged children, teachers, and non-human animals, such as ants, worms, and raccoons, viewing these entities not as fixed subjects, but as entangled lives that cross ontological divides between humans and nature. And this group of researchers, they're located all over the world. They actually presented one of their papers at AERA 2 years ago when I was kind of collecting my literature reviews. So I was really excited about that because it was not yet published, and now they've since published several papers using the Anthropocene really conceptually, in a really conceptually rich way to frame the work that they're doing in education. Okay, so that ends part 2, and now we're on to part 3. And I just thought this cover from Nature. For those of you that aren't familiar with Nature, it's one of the top 2 research journals in the natural sciences. So the Anthropocene was blazed on the cover of Nature earlier this year in a really kind of interesting graphic. So in the last part of this presentation, I'm going to discuss how I think with the Anthropocene in my own research and teaching. So I'm going to briefly go over the textual analysis that appears in my Environment and Society publication. And then I'm going to talk about how I use political ecology and citizen science in my own teaching in an Anthropocene course that I just taught this last quarter. And then I'm going to end by briefly talking about a project that is in its very early stages in a community garden where my students will be doing service learning. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, for this textual analysis, I took Chris' themes of the Anthropocene and I wanted to see if and how they appeared in the framework for the next generation science standards, which, by the way, is a 400-page PDF. So I created basically codes out of those themes and found that there were two of her themes that were really featured most prominently in the document. And the first one is that technology is our salvation in ameliorating environmental crises. And this was not surprising to me, given that for the first time in the United States, engineering education is now part of science education. So that emphasis on engineering and technology really, really featured prominently in the document. And this quote here is an example of that. So the document says, quote, "Scientists and engineers can make major contributions by developing technologies that produce less pollution and waste, that preclude ecosystem degradation. Typically, as human populations and per capita consumption of natural resources increase, so do the negative impacts on the earth, unless the activities and technologies involved are engineered otherwise." So what I found here was that this sounded very almost eco-modernist to me and in its embrace of technology. And I was really concerned with the lack of mention of reducing production or consumption in the document. So that was sort of like not even part of the conversation. And then in the second part of the document, and this is really where the feminist and posthumanist analysis comes in, is the idea that nature is a natural resource to be managed. So, and this is also very neoliberal, of course, right? So you in this quote, the word ecosystem services is actually used. It's used a lot in the document. Human beings depend on the natural world, but the natural world for us is just biodiversity and species systems that provide us with resources. Acknowledgement, the document does say that we are part of the natural world, but it's simply as a consumer of a benevolent nature's natural resources. So in education's humanist tradition, this passage ultimately ends up ontologizing the difference between humans and the other, reducing the natural world's biodiversity, or what appears as an inert amalgam of genes, species, and ecosystems. So, so this was published in my paper. And so the second way that I'm using the Anthropocene is in my teaching. So I had the freedom this quarter to develop two courses based on my own research interests, and I thought that the Anthropocene would be a really interesting way to frame a course, and I knew that there were a few other people doing it other places. So as I was collecting information for the Environment and Society paper, I had conversed with some folks in an interdisciplinary teaching group at Southwestern University who had shared some of their information with me. And I found these questions related to these that guided their course. So I modified them to get rid of some of what I felt was like extreme humanism in the questions. And these are the questions that guide the course that I taught this last quarter, which actually just ended yesterday. So how do various stakeholders define the Anthropocene? We looked at policymakers, scholars, and activists. How and why are humans changing the Earth systems? How are changes in the Earth systems affecting humans, other living beings in the environment? How are humans, other living beings in the environment responding to these changes? And how does thinking about the Anthropocene call into question what it means to be human? And I think that I liked the last question the best because it was really the most interesting for the students to dive into. And so what I wanted to do in this course, this is an interdisciplinary course, so we draw on work in the natural sciences, social sciences, and the humanities. And I really wanted to focus on this idea of public science, so that sort of second theme that was featured in the research literature, but I wanted to make it more critical. So I thought I'm going to have my students wear political ecology lenses as they participate in a citizen science, project. So a lot of scholars are arguing for greater engagement with community and participatory-based research, but much of the educational research literature related to citizen science, unfortunately, is not political or critical. Although I will say our EE Feminist Caucus member Carol Brandt presented a great paper at AAA a few weeks ago that was a really critical analysis of citizen science. So in my course, again, we deal with public science a lot. In citizen science, there are basically two models, which you all may or may not know about. These are contributory projects and grassroots community-based projects. So though I don't have stats, my hunch is that the former are far more common because they're cheap and easy. These would be the crowdsourced projects where scientists post online and regular citizens just contribute data. So whatever they're doing in their daily lives that fits with the project. Scientists, however, typically come up with these questions, not the community or the students. And as Burke and Hayden point out, and also Rebecca Lave, these projects can be somewhat fraught. Why? Well, because citizens become enrolled in neoliberal university projects in two ways. They contribute data that scientists publish in the scholarly literature to gain credit for tenure and promotion. So in effect, citizens are part of the neoliberal publication machine that we are all embroiled in. And sometimes the research has no clear benefit to society. And second, the data are sometimes actually used to leverage market-based solutions to environmental problems. So what I aim to do here is to have my students wear these political ecology glasses to think critically about the citizen science effort that they were participating in. I wanted them to gain a greater understanding of how public science works and to think about the kinds of public science they think that we need in the Anthropocene after they have participated in and then critically analyzed this project, this citizen science project. So these are the questions that sort of guided part of the assignment. And if anybody wants to see the assignment at some point, I'd be happy to share it with you. Okay, so then we're almost at the end. So these are photos, and I took these off of the website because this project is literally like something I'm beginning in January. So this is a community garden located within the community where I teach. And my students are going to be doing service learning here. So they're going to be not only working in the garden to help community members take care of their plots, because the woman who runs the garden told me that the community members that own the plots sometimes work such long hours they don't have time to take care of them in the ways that they would like. So they'll be doing that, and they'll also be working with elementary school kids who do after-school programs in the garden. So drawing on the sort of ontological questions the Anthropocene demands of us regarding what it means to be human, and thinking with research in the environmental post-humanities that considers ecological communities as multi-species and inclusive of humans, I'm conceptualizing this garden site not just as a place that grows food, people, and hope, which is the mission of the garden, but also one that fosters multi-species ecological communities situated within scaled political ecological arrangements. This is a very urban space classified as a food desert, and also one that has unfortunately been subjected to a lot of increase in crime rates in the last several decades. In this nascent project, I am currently thinking with a variety of multi-species, participatory, and digital ethnographic methods that will include having my students use digital ethnography as a means to tell lively stories about all sorts of lives in the urban garden, some of which research accounts typically conceptualize as devoid of agency. So I'm really interested in how the students can think about the space not just as a space for people, but also as a space for all sorts of other living entities that don't normally have a space in a highly urbanized environment. And that is the end, but I have this cool cartoon, and there's the website for the cartoon if you want to revisit it.
Great.